out! Nazgul!
Hold the lines! Come on. You telling me you wouldn't do it? Welcome back to the Microforge. I'm Albert, and on today's video, we are finishing off our Arnor build. Now, the new supplement from Games Workshop is just about to release. This time around, they're calling it the Rise of Angmar. Previously, it was the Fall of Arnor, and that is where we are taking the inspiration for all of this terrain. So, we've got 4 terrain pieces to get through, and I'll show you how we build it with a lot of foam and just a little bit of slice and slot.
We're going to start off with the simplest ruin. Now, I've changed some of the key details, especially around the corner, but it still always pays to look at the reference material to get an understanding of what the look and feel should be for this ruin. One thing I did really like was the blind arcades, or the arches that were sitting flush up against the wall. And so I took my small MDF cutting jig and started cutting out a series of archways, leaving a 5mm gap in between arches. The jigs are designed to work with 10mm thick foam, and I felt like that was a bit too thick, so I cut these in half, giving me 2 5mm strips. Then it was on to the corner piece, and I wanted this to be roughly 16mm by 16mm square, just big enough so that it would sit proud of the thickness of the wall. So the 10mm backing piece and then the 5mm arches that go on the front. I already had these backing wall pieces left over from a previous build, so I just grabbed those and used those and marked out where these blind arcades or these front archways would actually sit and cut off the excess pieces of material here. I knew I wanted to have a hole cut through to match the design from the actual book, and so I just marked that out with a pencil, figure out what I need to cut out to get this all to work. Then I go ahead and cut out with an X-Acto blade this little cutaway. This will make the ruin so much more playable. Instead of having models go the full distance around, they can cut corners. Always test the playability. Make sure that a model that you play with actually fits through the gap. Here, the model was a little bit too tall, and so I decided to go back and take a little bit more stonework out to make sure that gameplay would work for that 28mm model. Perfect. Then it's just a case of going through and scoring in all the brickwork, just as I always do. Nothing too special here. You might be wondering at this point why I didn't use a custom bespoke slice and slot archway here for the blind arcades, and really it's because I wanted to capture that old school vibe. Also, I felt like this bit of stonework might be more of a dressed piece of stonework. It's not performing any structural role, so I can conceive of it being a much finer grade, and therefore it won't have any big grout marks of where these big slabs of stone would have come together and been joined. Then I'm just using hot glue to glue these together. You can see here the corner piece hides the join and creates a really clean looking ruin. And then I'm using PVA glue to glue down all of these blind arcades to the wall themselves. And because it's only PVA, I do come back in and use some pins to make sure that they stay in the correct location whilst they dry. That does it for the first terrain piece. Let's do something a little bit more tricky. This is definitely my favorite build from this book. This was the one that I spent the most amount of time looking over all the source material, trying to glimpse this ruin from every different angle. The corner connections on this, and maybe this is where my OCD around corner connections come from, are really intricate. let's get into it. So I've got these custom slice and slot pieces. These are slightly different. They don't have the traditional C-shaped profile because they're going to be sitting flush against a back wall. Because they don't have a backing, you can actually press them in and mark them out on the foam like I'm doing here. Then, in order to cut out just that arch profile, I snap off a little bit of scrap XPS foam, and that gives me the perfect depth to cut that out. The spacing between the archways is exactly 10 mil, so I can use a scrap piece of XPS foam to make sure I get the perfect cut. And then once I've got it all marked out, I come along with my right angle and cut that excess foam away. There we go, a really nice snug fit. That'll look great when it's all finished. I repeat this process, and I also snip off where I want to break this archway using just a couple of model snips. Doesn't matter if the break is a little bit rough, I can clean that up with my hobby blade and make sure that it looks relatively organic. Again, reusing the other offcut so no piece goes to waste. That then gives me the 3 sides to the ruin. Now I want to cut out some of the archway detailing. I'm going to switch over to the crenellation jig that I recently released. If you want to pick up your own set of free files, go over to our website, microforgeminis.com, and you can get the laser cutting files for free. I'm only interested about the archways for this particular build, so I come along with the Proxxon and just slice this off. So I've got a really nice, neat row of these smaller archways to use for this build. Again, similar to the first ruin, the 10 mil is a bit thick, so I slice this in half and double the amount. Now, looking back at the source material, the actual length of these smaller archways is a little bit shorter, so I come back and trim those down again. And it just so happens that my arches fit perfectly. This was actually kind of a complete fluke, and I was super happy that that happened because otherwise it might not have looked as clean. Here I am just marking off 5 mil past where I know that wall will end, and that way that'll give me the extra length to create a nice clean corner as this material wraps around each side of that ruin. I want this to be a super clean corner, so I am mitering the edge here, just doing it by eye. It doesn't have to be super exact, but cutting it on that 45 degree so that I can get a really clean corner around there. This is obviously the short side, nothing goes to waste, so I use one of those offcuts and just mark where that is going to finish up. Again, a lot of these measurements are just by eye because I know the thickness of the material that I'm working with. Everything's either 10 mil or 5 mil thick, and so I can measure things by eye pretty quickly and pretty accurately. Also, it helps that this is a ruin after all, so if I get anything wrong, it's fine. I can deal with that in later stages when I'm actually doing the detailing. Nothing goes to waste in this build, so the offcuts from that battlement jig are now being recycled for the bottom of each of the archways. You can see here I'm cutting down some thinner slices, and they will help to add a little bit more depth and detail once the build is done. It'll all make sense once we start assembling all of these little pieces. Because these elements are very small, it's easier to just use PVA glue. They're not going to move around too much, and they'll dry soon enough because plenty of air can get into the cracks and crevices, ensuring that it actually dries over time. And here is the finished piece. So you can see, rather than it just being a little quarter arch, I've got a little bit more detail in there. The reason why I'm approaching it in this way is because this is an element that will sit hard up against a 3D printed component, which inherently has a lot more detail. So I'm spending the time here to make sure that as your eyes are drawn to those details, there's a consistent level of depth in the model itself. And I'm really happy with the way that this ended up turning out. I think it really adds a small but intricate detail And it's one of those things where somebody else looking at it for the first time might not even notice it. They would probably think that it is 3D printed as well as soon as you mention that the archways are 3D printed, but I'll know that it's actually a really nice handcrafted detail. Then it's time to assemble the inside walls. Here I'm just using hot glue for speed and ease, and I'm going to do a ugly butt joint between these two walls. And you might be thinking, but Albert, didn't you just say you hate doing ugly butt joints? And yes, I do. But don't you worry, we'll be hiding this little sin. It'll be yours and my little secret. With that now dry, I'm ready to attach it to its base. As always, the white base you can see on screen here is expanded PVC or EPVC. It's a really lightweight material. It doesn't warp or bend when it gets exposed to moisture. It's the perfect material. So with that now glued down, it's time to assemble the outer wall components. So first I glue on each of these little capstones. With all the capstones glued on, I can now assemble that outer wall and cover up that ugly butt joint. Here I'm using just some hot glue. Again, there's a lot of surface area for this to actually attach, so that hot glue will do a great job of gripping that. And you can see specifically here, we're covering up that ugly butt joint and we're creating a little negative detail. So a little recessed corner detail, which I absolutely love with this ruin. The really fun part is that the corner detail then changes on the upper level. This is something that I grappled with a lot because there's not a great deal of photos in the old source books that show it from the right angles. And by right angles, I mean the angle that I actually wanted to see it from. Because these are finger joints, I'm using some PVA glue to make sure that these all stick together nicely. And here you can see that corner detail now. So it changes from a recess to a standard kind of positive join. And I don't know why this corner detail excites me so much. I think it's my inner architectural nerd kind of coming out, thinking about the way that buildings turn corners and how to represent the hierarchy between different levels. I could go on and I will not bore you. I will save you that. Whilst this glue is still wet, I come along with the hot wire glue and I secure that in place on that upper level. The combination here of having the ability to glue it down quickly with hot glue, but still have the flexibility of the PVA glue is really, really helpful. Now all that's left to do on the main part of the build is glue on this fascia panel. Again, really love how this all looks. I love the fact that this kind of is almost a continuous piece of stone and everything else is broken up into that traditional masonry look. I'm really glad that I did this in foam and not in another 3D print. The 3D printed elements are fantastic and I love the added detail. However, it kind of locks you in. You have to build to certain dimensions, whereas you can be a little bit more free flowing with the foam. There's a little extra tolerance that you can gain by just kind of fudging things together. And the end build result here, I think, is fantastic. Again, the multi-layered corner. I just love how this corner looks and I can't wait to paint it up. There is an internal wall and this will help to support the floor structure that we're going to put over the top. Just using some thin popsicle sticks cut down to size and then laid directly over the top here.
So I could have sworn that I filmed the process of me making all of the components for this ruin, but then I went back and I looked at the footage that I had recorded and I definitely didn't record any of the process of how this was made. So instead of showing you how I crafted it, I thought, why don't I instead describe to you how I crafted these elements whilst we put them together? Wouldn't that be fun? Let's give it a shot.
You can see here how I got the curvature of this buttress using the large arch cutting jig. Let's quickly have a look at the source material. You can see it just in this top right corner here. I really wasn't a fan of the geometry of the buttress that they had originally created, and that's why I chose to change it. This is, I think, a little bit more reminiscent of what we see in the films in Minas Tirith with the large scale buttresses on the outer wall, that kind of sweeping foot, I'll call it, to the buttress. You can see here I'm gluing it straight to a leftover ruined piece of wall that I had lying around from a previous build. I'm using this 3D printed fence, which will give me the distance between the two buttresses. And then I just come in and I glue in some extra leftovers of that architrave piece that I had from the previous ruin that we just finished up. Again, using PVA glue just to glue these in place. I will use some pins to make sure that they don't slip and slide around as they dry. I'm not gluing in the 3D prints at this stage. That comes a little bit later. Now I'm going to attach it to that baseboard and work on the back of the ruin itself. So here I put that back wall on, and this again will provide the basis for our floor to sit on top of. So I've pre-made this one using some popsicle sticks. Again, there's a couple of cut out beams that sit underneath this to make sure that it's got the right amount of strength to sit on top there. And that's pretty much it. Now all I do is I come back in and finish off some of the detailing. I find when I'm building ruins in this way, you can build all the elements to a certain extent, but then once all of the pieces come together, it's good to try and harmonize all of the damage so that the pieces feel like they've all weathered as a single piece in their environment, as opposed to being 3 different pieces of foam stuck together and having slightly weird angles at different joints and intersections. And a ladder. So important to have ladders to support your gameplay. I've already pre-made that one, again, just out of popsicle sticks. And I add on a little bit of extra rubble for interest and also to break up the monotony. Always checking for gameplay, so I know that the models can actually use it. Now for the final ruin in today's tutorial. This one is by far the biggest and had me scratching my head a lot. There are again 2 layers, the outside archway and the inside brickwork, and they both kind of cut away at different intervals, and it's all a little bit confusing and made even more confusing by the fact that I cut out all of these pieces and then let them sit in a box for like 3 weeks. And then when I came back to figure out how to actually put this bloody thing together, I had completely forgotten. So it took me a little bit of reacquainting myself. Anyway, same process as we've gone through before, where I've got these tongue and groove joints on the end. I use some PVA glue. It gives it a really strong bond in the long term, but also allows me the flexibility to reposition it as I am assembling everything to make sure that these walls are still vaguely 90 degrees and sit how I want them to on the actual baseboard. Speaking of which, I've cut this one out and beveled the edge like I have with all the other bases, and I'll come through with some hot glue and glue that down off camera. So you can see here, this is the front face of that ruin. So we need to glue on the front archways. Again, I think it took me 2 or 3 goes to actually get the right ruins in the right location here. This corner is really interesting, having the back wall kind of dipping down and the arch sitting up. And again, you'll notice that there are multiple entry points to make this somewhat large ruin broken up a little bit more so that models can interact with it, move through it. So these ruins have the maximum amount of playability and don't just sit off to one side with models kind of skirting around it in gameplay. For me, that is the worst outcome for a terrain build. I love seeing people playing on my terrain and interacting with it. The Lord of the Rings game is fantastic for terrain interactions, and so I really enjoy building and crafting terrain with the intention of models really getting in and interacting with it all. So here, some hot glue to secure it in place, and then PVA at the bottom of the pillars. I'm hoping that that will give it just a little bit more tooth in connecting with the baseboard. This smaller piece I was a little bit worried about because there really isn't that much contact between the base and also the other ruin. I've PVA'd everywhere because I feel like the PVA will have a better long-term connection, and I've pinned that in place, and it seems to have held up well, at least so far. The final piece here, I'm just using PVA because I think I had run out of hot glue on this particular day, and so c'est la vie. Oh, good thing I used PVA glue because, you guessed it, I glued that arch in the wrong location. This is actually a really good advertisement for why you should use PVA and not necessarily hot glue, because if that had have been hot glue, I would have been in a lot more trouble in terms of the damage to the brickwork behind it. Then the only thing left to do is cut out these crenellations. You will have seen in my previous videos using that battlement jig. I make sure that these look suitably ruined and broken up. These internal walls really help to try and break up the actual flow of models between those two gaps. Here are some close-ups of all of those ruins, some of them still drying, but ready for the final stages of detailing before we get into the painting. So the final detailing of the build process. We use our good old friend, Sculpt-A-Mold. This is a homemade batch brew that I use. It's just paper pulp with a little bit of casting plaster, and I squidge that into the corners and anywhere where I feel like there would have been broken masonry, just trying to generally break up the flat, monotonous base that this building has been glued onto. With all of that in place, and whilst it's still wet, I come in with some pre-textured, pre-cut bricks, and I just squish these into the mix to make them feel like they've been submerged in this rubble pile for some time. This is a really satisfying process, and if you've got any toddlers or young children, I highly recommend getting them involved in this stage of the process. Off camera, I had my 4-year-old squishing bricks into little putty corners, and he absolutely loved this process, and he actually did a better job than I did in terms of creating a realistic brick pile. It's really interesting. Often when we're putting together these kinds of things, our eye is drawn to symmetry, and so unless you're being really careful and purposeful, you'll often try and create a symmetric composition. But for my 4-year-old, he just nailed it. He just did a fantastic job. Then we are on to the painting. Now, in previous videos, I have base coated my models in a brown paint with Mod Podge mix, but I'd run out of this mix. So I added in a whole bunch of black paint into this mix, and it's kind of a warm, dark gray. It doesn't really show up on camera. It's not really black, and there is still quite a bit of brown in it. but it is distinctly different to some of the other buildings that I've painted recently. And this has actually been a really interesting process because it's been a process of actually going back to some more traditional techniques. I didn't crack out the airbrush to base coat this time. I got some old grey paint from the hardware store, a big fat makeup brush, and just use this to essentially do a overbrush. So I haven't wiped off a lot of the paint, and I'm kind of going between a brushing and a stabbing kind of stippling technique over the foam. And once I get the majority of the paint off the actual brush itself, that's when I start to go back over the 3D printed components, because it's important to understand different materials when you're painting them take paint very differently. So this foam, you really have to work the paint onto it, whereas the 3D prints, they seem to take the paint much easier. And so you want to work from the foam onto the 3D print. So you can see here, I'm at the end of the kind of the brush cycle, and that's when I come down and I hit all of these 3D printed elements. And you can see the difference between how that 3D print takes the paint versus the foam around it. It's really interesting. It's something that you definitely need to be aware of when you're undertaking this kind of process. And it's just something that you get with a bit more practice. In recent times, I've been doing that first step with an airbrush, which has been probably a lot faster, but it actually doesn't give you the same level of depth. You can see here already in the corners, I've got these pre-established shadows, which I will further kind of heighten once we get to the weathering phase. But before we get to the weathering phase, I'm just going back over with my smaller dry brush and highlighting this up. So I'm adding in a little bit more cream into that initial gray, and I'll add in progressively more and more cream, that kind of beige paint, until the final dry brush is just a straight beige highlight. Now it's just picking out those final details in the straight beige, going over all the 3D prints lightly, making sure that all of those raised details are getting caught and highlighted with this final pass of the dry brush. Now I'm going to come back in with some contrast paints. I'm using a variety of different colors, some Militarum green from the Citadel range, some Wildwood, which is quite a dark brown, Skeleton Horde, which is a very light kind of beige color, and I'm essentially just wet blending these different contrast paints together. None of these are going on neat, and if I do apply them neat like I do here, I'll come back over with a bit more water to water those down so that you still get the transparency of that grey dry brush showing through to make sure that these timbers feel very aged. Finally, I'm cracking out the airbrush here, and I'm just establishing my first layer of grime over everything. So I've got a mix of artist inks in here, some green, some brown, some black, all mixed into a bit of a muddy, mossy color. And I'm focusing on all of the connection points. So where two surfaces meet, whether that's the wall meeting the ground, or two walls meeting, or vertical and horizontal surfaces meeting, because that's where you would traditionally see mold, mildew, grime, and dirt building up. It also helps to separate out the volumes between these different surfaces. Then I go back in and I pick out some individual bricks. Again, just trying to break up the monotony of having a very grey looking ruin. My approach here is to always look at where the bricks have been depressed and pick those out as the darkest points. Once all that's dry, I come back and do another dry brush of that beige color over the top to really make sure that this timber feels aged and worn, like it's been out in the elements. I also come back over and do a quick dry brush over all the areas where I have weathered, again just trying to unify all of those stones that I've darkened down a little bit. Now I've got this 3D printed little fence that is going to sit in between the different archways. I've spray primed this one grey, and I'm going to give it a base coat of some dark metallics. I'll glue this in at the same time that I do all of my ground cover. So you see here, I've already laid down the PVA across the whole base, and I'm just about to put down my tile, grout, and sand and coffee ground mix that I always use. But before I do that, I'm going to glue in these fences. You'll see I've just used a little bit of 2-part epoxy to make sure that they don't move around. They're a very snug fit, so I'm not too worried about these ever popping out, and having all of the dirt around them with a PVA glue will help to hold it in place at the bottom as well. Now I'm ready to put that ground cover on. It's the same ground cover that I always use, so if you're interested on more details, go back and watch one of my earlier videos. Once that's all down and covered, I come back with my isopropyl alcohol and spray that all over. This will have a capillary effect and make sure that all of the glue soaks into that mix properly and just make it rock hard, and none of that is ever going to come off. If there's any areas that look like needing a little bit more glue, I come back in with some watered down PVA glue and just put that over the top. Before I do anything else, I also glue on this pre-painted ladder to make sure that the models can actually get up to this upper level. Now it's time to do some more weathering. I want these cast iron fences to be all rusted up, and this was a perfect chance to try a different material. This is dirty down rust. I've seen loads of hobbyists go on and on about how amazing it is, so I thought I would bust it out here and give it a go. What I've heard is that you need to shake this a lot, keep it quite warm, and then it also helps to dry it with a hairdryer to accentuate that rusty look. And I was really happy with how this all turned out. So much so I went and bought the dirty down moss, which I actually like even more than the dirty down rust, and I got really carried away adding this again into all of those cracks and crevices and corners. I love using this paint because it kind of dries inconsistently, so you get these little, it's almost like it's self-highlighting. So there'll be parts of it that are lighter, so it looks like the moss is kind of dried out, and then parts of it that will be darker. And so you get this really beautiful mottling effect between the greens and the rusts, and the contrasting colors I think also really helps. And I love that whole process. The only thing left to do now is to flock the base, and this is using the same method that I've used over the past few videos. So if you're keen to get more details, go back and maybe watch some of those videos. I blend between different foam flocks, different grades. Some are fine, some are more coarse, different colors, back and forth to build up what I think is kind of a believable blend of colors. You don't need too many different colors, you just need to blend them distinctly, if that makes sense. So have some areas which are only light, some that are only dark, and then blending between those and mixing it up in terms of having some coarse foam as well. It's an iterative process, so I like to add in more and more over the top. I don't necessarily wait for things to dry anymore. I used to wait for each layer to kind of dry, but that just takes too long. And ultimately, I don't think you gain anything from waiting that extra time. So where I've got some more coarse foam, I'll lay that down and I'll make sure that the isopropyl soaks through it and come back in with the PVA watered down just to make sure that all of that gets locked in place. When I see foam that doesn't have enough glue, I'll add some more in over the top. And I'm also planning for the next phase, which is to come back in with some leaf scatter so I can add in some extra glue for that leaf scatter to kind of stick around onto. So here you can see my leaf blend. It's a mix of birch seeds, some leftover foam flock, some chopped up reindeer moss, some coarse flock, all kind of smashed together. And this again helps to break up the uniformity of that base and really sell this as kind of an autumnal ruin where, you know, no one's been here for a very long time. The final thing that I want to do is just add some additional leaves onto this upper level. And I found a really good way of doing this is to dab the glue on first and then get the same brush that has some glue left on it and just use that to pick up the individual leaves, and then hoping that the glue will hold it in place. This seemed to work actually really, really well. So I was really happy with how that all turned out. Thinking about, again, the corners where leaves are going to gather, And then it's just coming through with the final piece of static grass tufts. And this build is now done. So you've seen me go through all the techniques on this building, but let's get over to the grand reveal. I am so glad to have finished up this build just in time for the release of this new supplement from Games Workshop. Even though there is a lot of talk about the supplement being redundant in light of the new edition, I'm still super hyped for all the narrative aspects of the new release, and I can't wait to run through some of those narrative scenarios now that I've got a full table of themed terrain. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and make sure you head over to our My Mini Factory store where you can find all of the files used in the build from today's video. Until next we are together though, have fun hobbying.